This is Tommy's Outdoors, episode 19, and it is a special edition of the podcast. Special in the sense that the podcast usually is published every 2 weeks, and this episode drops just right week after we published previous episode. So you can think of it as we switching for 3 weeks for every week schedule for publishing podcast. And the reason for that, and the reason it is a special edition of the podcast, is that we are very close to the 1st of September. And as some of you might know, on the 1st of September, deer season opens in Ireland. So a lot of you hunters out there certainly hoping to kill a deer this season. Certainly I do. And so I thought that it's no better time to publish special deer season opener edition of the podcast with my guest, Damien Hannigan, from Irish Deer Commission. So Irish Deer Commission is a relatively new organization that I think does absolutely fantastic job related to deer conservation and in general management of deer, welfare of a deer. And this organization is really close to my heart, because what they're doing is what I'm saying for a long time, and even on this podcast in the Tommy's Outdoors blog, that all stakeholders and all users and all people who are involved in the area and management of the wildlife should come to the table and talk together and come up with the plans for management and conservation together. And this is exactly what Irish Deer Commission is trying to do. One other thing is that there is an event called Route Walk on Sunday, the 14th of October, in Killarney National Park. It is hosted by National Parks and Wildlife Service. It is free of charge and open to non-members, but the places are limited. So to ensure that you have your place in that wonderful event, email info@irishdeercommission.ie and book your place in Route Walk on Sunday, 14th of October in Killarney National Park. And now, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Damien Hannigan. With me today, Damien Hannigan. You are Public Relations Officer in Irish Deer Commission. Damien, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for asking me. Delighted to meet you and speak to you.
That's a pleasure. So this is going to be kind of special edition of the episode, because usually what we're doing is the episode drops every 2 weeks. But I think this one will drop next week, and it's going to bypass some of the people who are already queued up. But there's a good reason for that. 1st of September is approaching, and the deer season will be open. So we can treat that episode as a deer season opener special kind of thing. And I think, what the better guest than officer from Irish Deer Commission. So as far as I understand, Irish Deer Commission is kind of new organization. So maybe let's just lay out the scene. Can you tell us what is Irish Deer Commission and what is your role as a public relations officer in Irish Deer Commission?
Yes, the Irish Deer Commission is a new organisation. It's a new national voluntary association founded by 15 individuals who are passionate, I suppose, about deer in every aspect in terms of their conservation, hunting, and most importantly in terms of promoting what is best practice in terms of deer and deer management, in terms of the conservation. So very much a member organisation. It represents the views and interests of its members. I suppose it holds a busy series of events for its members, and it campaigns and promotes in terms of various aspects in terms of deer, from wildlife crime or deer poaching to deer management, or for example our native red deer in County Kerry, in terms of their conservation. So very much I suppose they will be the main objectives of the association. In total, there are 15 aims and objectives, but they're the core issues as such. In terms of my own role, I suppose I've been involved in deer and deer management myself most of my life. I've qualified as a deer manager under Lantra in the UK, and I'm an avid, I suppose, deer hunter, a deer conservationist, because I think most hunters are also conservationists as well. If you speak to most hunters, people find that they're very much focused in terms of the conservation of deer as well. But my own role has been a busy one since the Irish Deer Commission was formed, in the sense that we talk to a lot of good people like yourself in terms of various interviews and publicising I suppose the business of the association and its aims and objectives.
Yeah. So there are many, well, maybe not many, but quite a few deer organizations. Okay. And I share a little story. I had a time in my life when I was just mad about shark fishing, right? And probably listeners of that podcast heard that story already 25 times. So I'm going to skip that. Needless to say, I was like, for 2-3 years, I was all the time at sea shark fishing. And one of the first things I've done, I bought a book. The book was, I believe, by Richard Paris, called Sharks in UK Waters. And I read the book, and at the end of the book, they said like, oh, and there is an organization called Shark Trust, right? And that didn't take me long. It's like, oh yeah, this is the one, because from the very beginning, when I first cast the hook into the river, my first thought was like, okay, but how am I going to ensure that these fish will be there a year later and 10 years later? So like you mentioned, conservation was always part of that. To me, at least in my mind, it's very natural. So Shark Trust, I was member of Shark Trust, become the next day, and it's like 10 years now when I'm a member of a Shark Trust. And then there's another organization in Ireland, Irish Wildlife Trust, and I have on the podcast Padraig Fogarty from Irish Wildlife Trust, and we spoke about various issues. That's a very interesting episode, and I think it's gonna be online, published just after ours. But the little bit feedback I gave it to him was like, I was aware of the Irish Wildlife Trust all the time, but somehow I never become a member. I am a member since, after talking to him, but it was like something was missing. And when it comes to deer, we have Irish Deer Management Forum, we have Deer Alliance, we have Wild Deer Association of Ireland, and similarly, I kind of looked at the websites, looked at everywhere, and was like, and somehow when I learned about the Irish Deer Commission, it was something that says like, yes, that's the one. So I became a member of Irish Deer Commission, and so I have my reasons behind that. But I would like to hear from you, like, what do you think? What distinguished Irish Deer Commission from other organizations that you can go out there and become a member, and they're like the Irish Deer Alliance and so on?
Yeah. I don't think there's any, first of all, I don't think there's any difference in the sense of organizations, in the sense of every organization has its own aims and objectives. And I think the more organizations that we have representing deer hunters, deer conservation, deer management, best practice, the better. So I would say from the Irish Deer Commission's point of view is that we just have our own set of aims and objectives. We don't necessarily look at any other organization to sort of say, can we do something better than them or do something different?
So there's no competition going on.
There's no. I would say it's a close knit community. We've approximately 5,200 licensed deer hunters in Ireland, and it's a fairly close community between those individuals, and there's a crossover. So I would say within organizations, obviously some organizations have more of a focus on conservation, and some organizations have a focus very much more, say, in terms of the hunting side of things. So I think it's not where I would say, in terms of if you were to look at our website, irishdeercommission.ie, you'll see is that we're a kind of a one-stop shop in terms of all things deer. From the conservation, from best practice. So within our website, we have a section in terms of best practice guides, which were compiled by the Irish Deer Management Forum. And in that, you have information that's suitable for hunters, suitable for foresters, suitable for farmers. So it's there because everybody that I just mentioned there have their own issues in terms of deer, or their own perceptions. And it's one of the things we see in Ireland is that the knowledge gap that's there in all sectors, not just in any one particular sector, but the knowledge gap in terms of farming, forestry, hunters. There is a knowledge gap there, and sometimes that gap is filled by maybe what they read in the media or what they read on social media, rather than actually what is fact about deer and their management.
And do you see like a part of your role, kind of this education of the wider public about deer management and the issues related?
Very much so, and I think the topic of deer has become a very emotive issue in recent times.
Yeah.
In particular, in County Kerry and County Wicklow come to mind.
Yes.
Where, on one side we have farmers who have probably are experiencing one of the worst fodder crises in history, and the sight of deer eating their grass is understandably not to be welcomed. And it's emotive. On the other side, then we have a protected species, because deer are obviously protected under the Wildlife Acts. We have our largest land mammal, an iconic animal, and if you take, for example, in County Kerry, a significant importance in terms of a very large tourism industry in County Kerry. Because I think if you were to talk to any hotelier in County Kerry, for example, they will tell you a lot of people come from around the world to see the red deer, for example, in Killarney National Park. It's a huge tourism draw. So deer, so it's a very emotive subject, and I suppose in between those two, that tug of war in terms of landowners on one side and conservationists on the other side, in the middle you have deer, and are caught up in that, and I suppose you have hunters as well, because hunters, the length and breadth of Ireland work in partnership with local landowners and farmers in supporting them in terms of managing deer at a sustainable level. Because as we know, deer without a natural enemy, it does fall on man to manage their numbers.
Yes.
So it is important that we support landowners in terms of that have genuine deer problems. Probably part of the challenge sometimes is to educate landowners in terms of what is a sustainable population of deer in an area. To some landowners, one deer may be perceived as unsustainable.
One is one too many.
Is one too many. And that's, I wouldn't say that's the norm, to be fair. The majority of landowners that I come across are happy to see deer on their land. Obviously, if they look into their field and to see 30 deer, that's a different story, understandably. So it is an emotive subject, and it has become very much emotive. You only need to look at some of the media coverage in the last, say, 12 to 24 months.
In general, hunting is struggling with the public perception and with the acceptance, right? So this is also something I'm touching on the podcast quite often. Kind of educate people about role of hunting and what that is, right? So this is also probably something that you're working on.
Yeah, what I find is it's a good point in the sense of what I find with deer management or the culling of deer is that while the certain types of hunting can be very emotive in the public's view, and it's not to suggest that people that are non-hunters say it's a positive thing to cull deer, but I think most people understand that deer have to be managed. It's my own experience is that while the thought or the view of deer being culled or managed might appeal to everybody, I think most people understand at this stage that deer need to be managed and need to be culled, and that part of that is culling. People often say to me, can we not dart them and make them infertile, or can we transfer them to somewhere else, but unfortunately, the realities are, while they are valid suggestions, is that to dart deer is very expensive and is hugely risky, because when deer are darted, there's actually a lot of deer don't survive from that. And the issue in terms of translocating, then, for example, we regularly get feedback where people say, can we not transfer the deer from Killarney National Park to Mayo or Galway? But the fact of the matter is, in County Kerry, we know the red deer are a unique
it's a subspecies of red deer.
Correct, that have existed here over 6,000 years.
Right.
And if we move them to another part of Ireland, there's non-native red deer in those counties, and they just breed.
Like in Wicklow, right? Then they hybridizing with Sika.
Correct.
And that's a difference between red deer in Wicklow and red deer in Kerry. That's why there are different rules in hunting on both.
Yeah, I suppose in Wicklow, I know the most recent research done on hybridization between red deer and Sika deer, which is a man-made scenario rather than something that naturally takes place in the wild.
Oh yeah, Sika is native from Japan. Right?
Japan, correct, yeah. So if we look at in terms of Wicklow, is that we're now in a situation where approximately 40% of the deer population is hybrid, Sika red hybrid.
Oh, wow.
We've no red deer left in Wicklow, just Sika deer. So at this stage, the hybridization has effectively wiped out red deer in County Wicklow, and we just have Sika and hybrids. But it is a real risk in County Kerry, for example, where if hybrids were to get into County Kerry and to start to breed with the native red deer, which is a real risk because hybrids have been observed in the West Cork area. So it's a real conservation threat to red deer in Kerry going forward, that if these hybrids get into County Kerry and start breeding, we effectively could wipe out a population of deer that has existed for over 6,000 years.
But the hybridization really started with mating between red deer and Sika. And Sika are present in Kerry.
Correct.
Somehow they so far they didn't hybridize. Maybe they did, because you're saying about the Cork. But it seems to be like something is that they're not hybridizing that easily, at least as it happened in Wicklow.
Yeah, I think with in terms of County Kerry, so there has been research done in terms of has hybridization taken place in County Kerry, and we know for a fact that that's not the case. It hasn't taken place. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, hybridization is a man-made scenario. So, a Sika deer...
But man-made in a sense that the two species were put together on one landscape, or a man-made scenario in terms like the man caused them, kind of interbreed or...
So for example, we know in the case of the hybridization in Wicklow, for example, took place in Powerscourt Estate, where Lord Powerscourt had Sika and red deer in the same enclosure, and was known for experimenting with different species.
Okay, yeah. That's my point. So man-made scenario, not in the sense that that just happened by putting two species on the landscape. It actually was purposely created.
Right, okay.
Right.
So thankfully that hasn't occurred in County Kerry. But there is, as I mentioned, real threats in terms of coming from West Cork. We know on the Limerick border we have non-native red deer. So it's very much something that we've been calling for in County Kerry, is a coordinated deer management group of all stakeholders, farmers, foresters, hunters, and so on. And it's not just about culling deer, but it's just about facing the realities of the risks that I suppose red deer face in County Kerry. And to deal with some of those emotive issues that we hear about.
Yeah, there's a very sensible approach that's based on evidence and listen. So there's really many things that I want to talk about with you. So maybe you mentioned about the kind of perception, and I mentioned that perception of the hunting. I think that this is not so much, you say, like most people recognize the need of managing a deer and so on, but it seems to me like where people have a problem, they have a problem with actually animal dying, right? It's like, I like deer, I don't like anything bad happen to deer. So that's the one thing. And then other thing, which hunters kind of are on the wrong side of that equation, is like, I think it's a problem. People have a problem that someone goes out and hunt deer for its leisure, right? And somehow they don't have a problem with deer being killed by wolves, because it's natural, even though this is much more horrific death, arguably, to the deer being pulled apart alive by wolves. They don't have that much problem with actually someone being paid to go and shoot a deer. But when someone is paying money to shoot a deer, that somehow it's bad, right? And I think this is where sometimes hunters are struggling. Do you think that this is the case?
I would say is that in terms of hunters, I suppose there's two aspects that we could look at this. Okay, one is a traditional deer stalker who is counting down the days to the beginning of 1st of September, like a child on Christmas morning, waiting for the hunting season to open. And I'm one of those children as well. I'm looking forward to the 1st of September. So the vast majority of hunters feel that way, and they also, when they go out, they have a respect for their quarry. If they do cull an animal and select an animal that's suitable to be culled, is that animal is consumed. The venison, which is extremely healthy and tasty meat, is consumed by that hunter or family and friends. So I would think that would be the overwhelming majority of deer hunters. I suppose increasingly what we've seen in Ireland is a growing industry around the tourism aspect of it. So we have lots of tourists come in to fish. We have lots of tourists come in for clay pigeon shooting. Now we have a lot of tourists that come in to go deer stalking. And deer stalking, as a sport worldwide. If you go to Scotland, for example, and talk to people in rural Scotland,
massive.
It's a huge industry. It's it sustains so many jobs, and it's the same here in Ireland. So I think I suppose people often have this perception maybe of Cecil the Lion story. If we look at that, where an animal
that messes things up.
Where an animal is the perception is an animal is shot for fun. The reality is, agree or disagree, is that this type of industry gives money back to the local economy, and it creates jobs. And I would say is that very much so from any hunter's point of view is regardless, be it someone that's coming as a tourist to Ireland to hunt, or someone that's resident in Ireland, I would say, and I mentioned earlier on, hunters are conservationists. Hunters have a respect for their species. The objective is, when an animal is culled and the right animal is selected, that it's at the center of that is the animal's welfare, so that it's culled quickly, efficiently, and humanely. And I think that's the objective of any hunter that you will speak to.
Yeah, no doubt, and like you mentioned, the respect for the the venison, the meat that that I don't know a hunter who would allow their meat to get spoiled.
Yeah.
Versus people who are they're against hunting, but then they go into the mall and they buying steak and chicken, and then it goes off because they so that's
and I think is that in any sector of society people have various views and they're entitled to their views, and I would respect all views in the sense if someone disagrees with hunting, that is their choice and their prerogative and so on, but that's like...
Listen, Damien, I just want to touch on the hunting and conservation. Okay. Because we had a chat before we started recording a little bit about conservation and so on. And obviously, through the media, YouTube videos and other media, a lot of information about hunting goes from the United States, right? Obviously, and those celebrity hunters and so on. And this is a very commonly repeated phrase, the hunters are conservationists, it's all about conservation and so on and so on. And in the United States, the system is just wonderful with I think it was a Peterson Act, where I may be making a mistake here, but there is a part of tax from every firearm and cartridges and every outdoors goods that goes towards the conservation. So by the sheer fact of purchasing a rifle and ammunition, people contributing to the conservation, and they have all the system of tags and so on. So there is no doubt. Now, coming to the Irish reality, like I said, I started my adventure with hunting 3 years ago. And throughout these 3 years ago, I spent thousands of euro, right? A couple of thousands of euro between the firearm and gun club membership and ammunition and all these things. And from all this money to deer conservation, I feel like I contributed precisely €0. And the only moment when there was an opportunity to kind of get some of my money towards deer conservation, which is deer license, guess what? Deer license is free, right? So this is the argument that I very much want to make, that hunters are conservationists and should, and I know that, like I said, most of the countries care about the animal, care about animal welfare. They want animal on the landscape and so on. But because that contribution is like a monetary contribution is in my view non-existent in Ireland. I have a hard time on making that argument that all the hunters are conservationists and they're actually making good job at protecting the animal. How do you see that role, hunters as a conservationists in Ireland?
I suppose we're probably talking about two slightly different things in the sense of what you described in terms of America and the contribution going towards conservation. I suppose that what we're talking about there is the financially supporting the conservation of a species or species in general, as opposed to the conservation work that hunters do in terms of, so for example, if you take Killarney National Park, it's widely observed now within areas of Killarney National Park there's clearly too many deer. Where we've come from a scenario in the 1970s where we only had 60 deer left in Killarney National Park, and the species was under threat. So, you know, in terms of, and you can see that there's parts of Killarney National Park, I mean, damaged, not alone just by deer, but by goats, by sheep, by other herbivores. So they're causing real damage to the wider ecosystem. So I suppose in terms of, that's one aspect of it, but I think in terms of on a day-to-day basis, hunters within the hunting season from September to February are managing deer in areas to reduce the impact on the wider ecosystem. I suppose hunters and organisations like the Irish Deer Commission are promoting best practice in terms of how deer are managed, but also we're ensuring that deer, that the herd remains at a healthy, sustainable level that's acceptable to all land users. Because it'd be very much easy for hunters maybe not to speak up, and we could end up in a scenario where we say deer are completely wiped out, you know, because they're impacting on agriculture. So I think that's more the conservation work from hunters as opposed to maybe financially contributing to conservation. And I would say the demographics in terms of, say, Ireland and most countries in terms of conservation is very different than my experience. So if I speak to people in other countries in Europe alone, they would view deer very much as an asset, including landowners, where in some sectors here, not to suggest all, but some sectors here would see deer as vermin, as a pest. So we have a very different view, first of all, in terms of deer, and not before we even get into the topic of conservation. But equally, I would see is that in terms of how we fund conservation here, so if you take the department with responsibility in culture, heritage and Gaeltacht, in terms of, in my observation would be, it's an extremely under-resourced department. We have lots of fantastic people working there, very talented and skillful people, but a very under-resourced department in terms of deer. If we even look across at, you mentioned earlier on about fishing, you know, inland fisheries, for example, is probably, you know, a far greater resources and greater energy put into in terms of conservation of fish. But in terms of deer, in my experience, would be is that we absolutely don't have a focus in terms of conservation at a government level.
Right.
It falls on organisations like the Irish Deer Commission to start promoting conservation, or you mentioned the Irish Wildlife Trust earlier on as well, in terms of promoting or speaking for deer or deer conservation in the media to try and highlight the issues. But really, as I mentioned earlier on, we all need to get around the table in terms of hunters, landowners, conservationists, national parks, and start talking about how do we manage and conserve deer.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic what you're saying, because and probably this is what made me to kind of subscribe to the idea of Irish Deer Commission, because I'm very much in favor of a dialogue, or however many parties are at the table and actually. So okay, so number one, what you said, if I understand correctly, you said that conservation, hunters' contribution to conservation is more from the bigger perspective of the landscape rather than particularly deer and the welfare of deer. So I get that. Tell me, what's the conservation status of deer? I mean, and the reason I'm asking that question is like that there's a common perception that there's more and more deer. There's more deer than there ever were, right? And this is, so again, coming back to me, you know, if I want to harvest a deer and remove the deer from the environment, I would like to know if I'm not doing something bad. Okay, so I started questioning how many deer, is any problem with deer? And overwhelming response I have, there's more deer than there ever was. There's plenty of deer. And like I said, shoot them, because they're like, well, shoot away. And then when I was talking with Padraig Fogarty from Irish Wildlife Trust, he said like, well, we actually don't have an idea how many deer is in Ireland. And then when I was last year, when I was coming back from a hunt, I was packing in the car, and I met the guy, and we started conversations like, are you shooting here? Are you hunting here? Yes, I'm a landowner. And obviously I'm asking a question. Are there, is it more deer? Is it less deer? And he said like, it's less. It's much less deer than it was here, right? I say, oh, that's the alarm, right? And then I shared that story with some other guy who is he's also involved in like yourself in deer stalking and controlling population in Wicklow. And he said like, well, yeah, if your man is saying it doesn't matter, because it talks about the area, and when the deer is pressurized, they may respond to the pressure and just move out from the area. It doesn't mean there's a less deer and so on. So here's a question for you. What's the status of deer? Is it plenty? Is it not enough? Is it how, is hunting sustainable? Because the only conservation measures is open season, as far as I know, and that open season runs for almost 6 months, and during deer season you can shoot however many you want. We don't have a system of tags. We don't have a system of anything. So do you think it's too generous? Is it enough? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I would say, the point in terms of too many, too little, it's something we constantly hear. And you've alluded to your interview with Patrick Fogarty, is that, and people have heard me say this before, we do not know in any part of Ireland in terms of trends, in terms of deer either increasing or decreasing. What we do know is that, and again, this data is unverified, but national parks produce data annually in terms of what they call hunter cull returns. So when a hunter is applying for his deer hunting license each year, he makes a cull return stating how many deer he shot, what species, and in what county. But from that data, even though unverified, it does give us and show us a trend that, for example, last year we know there was over 37,000 deer culled in Ireland, declared as culled in Ireland. And that's an increase on the previous year. So we were at a situation where for a number of years, the number of deer in Ireland was actually increasing, and then it became static for a number of years, and we've seen an increase again. But that is mirrored with a significant increase in the number of hunters.
Yes.
So
not deer, hunters.
Yeah, so hunters. So we've seen a threefold increase in the number of deer hunters in the last 10 years in Ireland, for example. Significant increase. And again, last year,
there's most hunters per person in Ireland than any other country in the world.
I would say the opposite, in the sense of we have 5,200 approximately deer hunters in Ireland. If you look, for example, I was in Pennsylvania in America a number of years ago hunting, and on the opening day of the hunting, just in that state alone, there was over 1 million hunters.
Yeah, but there's much more group. So that's actually data. I read it somewhere that Ireland is most hunters per person percentage.
Yeah,
than any other country in the world.
Yeah, I haven't come across that statistic.
Yeah.
It may be true. What I would say is that just in terms of so in terms of the fact of the matter is we don't know if deer numbers are increasing or decreasing. There's some areas where we visually can see deer numbers are higher, because you can just see the number of deer on the ground, and they are the norm. So if you take in County Kerry, for example, obviously within Killarney National Park, which is managed by national parks rather than by hunters, and which should continue to be the case considering their conservation importance, you can clearly see too many deer in some areas of Killarney National Park. Right. When you go outside of Killarney National Park and you walk the mountains in Kerry, there's some areas you will struggle to meet any deer. Yeah. And then what you would increasingly see is that the traditional hunting areas like Quilcha Forestry, mountains, due to hunting pressure or to illegal hunting, or maybe farming pressure or maybe gorse fires, have moved deer out of those areas. And what we're seeing is that during the Celtic Tiger years, if you look around a lot of areas, there was a lot of land planted with forestry on private farmland. And a lot of this farmland now has come to what they call pre-ticket stage, which is ideal habitat for deer. Because the deer can just walk in and it virtually disappears. It can't be seen until it comes out to feed. Yeah. But what happens when this forestry gets to this stage is that it effectively, underneath every piece of grass disappears. Yeah. It's like a desert, and it forces deer onto farmland then to feed.
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing in certain areas, is that where hunters are saying, God, I'm going to my traditional hunting area, I'm not seeing many deer. And then on the flip side of it, then we're hearing reports from landowners to sort of say, I have an unsustainable level of deer on my land. And if you look at the geography and the demographics of these areas, there's a lot of private forestry that's holding deer in those areas that are not being managed. And we know if deer are not managed, their population can effectively increase by 25% per year on average. So you can imagine if an area goes unmanaged for, say, 4 years, you can virtually double your population in that area. So what we are seeing is, the fact of the matter is, what we're seeing is that some areas where deer numbers are quite low, and complaints from hunters, and that's across the country. Other areas where deer numbers, and localised areas where deer numbers appear to be high. But again, we don't have a census. There's no count has been done. It's not like farm animals that you can just walk into a field and start counting.
It's just estimation always.
Yeah, the nature, the habitat and the terrain that they live in, it's impossible to count. And so the fact of the matter is we don't know. But again, if you look at international best practice in terms of that, it's one of the cornerstones in terms of managing deer is that you know how many deer you have on your ground.
Yeah, that's where you're starting.
So for example, every year I go to Scotland, and the area we're involved in a management cull is that they know how many male, female, juvenile deer they have on their land, and they develop a deer management plan around that. And obviously at the centre of that deer management plan is the welfare of the animal. So that's first and foremost. And from there, then they decide they work out in terms of how many males they need to cull, how many females they need to cull, and so on, in terms of keeping the herd healthy. And I suppose that the habitat that they live in can sustain their numbers as well. And we're so far away from anything like that in Ireland, in the sense of having local deer management groups that are all working together. It's not overly run by any one sector. Local hunters, involved, as opposed to having a individual hunter or bringing in someone that's maybe a private company to do the culling. But it's important that local hunters on the ground are involved in any deer management plan. But we're so far away from that, as I mentioned, in Ireland, in terms of having a handle in terms of the numbers of deer that we have.
But this is kind of like a mission of Irish Deer Commission, right? To kind of try to implement those management plans that have many stakeholders.
Correct.
So how you intend to do that? How you intend to achieve that?
Yeah, I suppose first of all we're looking to work with all stakeholder groups, farmers, foresters, hunters, and so on. Because as I mentioned earlier on, sitting around the table, everybody talking is the way we foresee it. So I think it's not the case that any organisation or individual in the morning can sort of say, right, we're going to develop a deer management plan for Ireland. Because every local area has its own unique issues and challenges. So it has to be something that has to come from a local group. If you look at I mentioned the hunter cull returns earlier, in terms of 37,000 deer. Approximately 14,000 of that number were culled in County Wicklow.
Right.
And if you were to take the counties of Galway, Donegal, Cork and Tipperary and Wicklow, it accounts for about 80% of the national cull.
Yes.
So there's a lot of counties in Ireland where deer are not an issue. At a county level, there may be individual pockets within those counties, localised areas, but overall, so it's just a case of people in those counties that I mentioned coming together, and they've already started to do this in County Wicklow, of forming deer management groups. That's not overly weighed in terms of one particular stakeholder group. That is a balance, and it takes account of everyone's interests and needs. My experience is doing that is a positive thing, but it's also quite emotive. Yes. It is quite emotive, and it's as I mentioned earlier on, we've been through one of the worst fodder crises in history, and it's impacting farmers' livelihoods, and so on. So it's quite an emotive topic. So we'd very see that much as the way forward, in terms of forming local deer management groups, but equally as well is that through our website, irishdeercommission.ie, we're always trying to promote, as I mentioned, in terms of what best practice is, raising awareness in the media, in terms of the conservation and management of deer.
Yeah.
We are, Dr. Ruth Carden would be probably Ireland's leading deer academic in terms of conservation and management. And we're currently working on a piece of work at the moment where we're compiling deer distribution data for the entire island of Ireland and islands, because we have deer on 4 islands off of Ireland as well. And that's looking at saying what species and where are they present.
Yeah.
So it's not going to give us a number, but it's just going to show what the presence of deer are in particular areas.
And you're working also to try. Are you trying to establish those local, I suppose, communities or local groups that then can kind of lobby and so is that the idea, that you have a group, and if on any particular area you get all these stakeholders come together, then they can establish some rules on that area and enforce them? Is that the idea?
Correct, yeah. And if you look in parts of Europe, for example, in Germany, it's very much managed at a local level,
right?
Like that.
And what's the law status? How does it look from the perspective of the law to establish a group who, for example, I don't know, North Kerry or whatever region, decided, okay, we want deer managed in a special way, this way.
Yeah.
Right. How then it goes into legislation, or how does it get backing from the law?
I think the management of deer, regardless of if it's through a local group or an individual, deer have to be managed within the law. And as we know, deer are a protected species under the Wildlife Acts. So, and there's a specific open season, as we know, from deer from 1st of September to 28th of February. So any management of deer obviously has to be done within the current legislation and law. So I don't think it would be a scenario where groups are looking to, I suppose, change the law or anything like that.
No, I was just thinking about the scenario when all these stakeholders coming in and they say like, well, we don't want any hunter to take more than 5 deer in a season. Yeah. Right. And then how they can come about enforcing that, because then someone comes in and said like, well, I don't care what you said. Overall Irish law says that I can take however many I want. Yeah. So my question is like, is there any mechanism where that group then can enforce any specific regulations on the area that they want to manage?
Again, if you look at best practice internationally, I mentioned earlier on, is that the first thing is you're looking is to see what your population of deer by species, by sex in an area. From that, then you're developing out your deer management plan. So that says that we need to call so many females, so many males, juveniles. And normally what would happen is that if you have an inclusive approach where hunters and all stakeholders are involved, that you're sitting around and you're saying we need to call X number of deer per year to keep the herd at a sustainable level. And that's where your numbers come from there. I think if you don't include hunters locally, there's a danger of what you just said there. Someone sort of saying, okay, over here on one side we have people developing a plan, and we've actually left the people that are on the ground locally involved in hunting out of that plan. So they're just going to cull whatever number they require. Where I think if everybody's included and the people that are on the ground are included, then you have everybody singing from the same hymn sheet.
And then potentially down the line that they can develop some sort of a tag system or whatever, and then if all landowners are on the board as well, then they can, before they give a permission to somebody to shoot on their land, say like, well, you can shoot on my land, but actually this is the tag or whatever, this is how much you can take, no more. And
it is something that's been my work with the Irish Deer Management Forum, which is a government group formed of various stakeholders. It's one of the recommendations that we made to the respective ministers was that a tagging system would be brought in place.
Great.
The issue around the tagging system is that in terms of how many tags do we distribute, and this comes back to the issue I mentioned in terms of the population of deer. So are we giving out too many? Are we giving out too little?
But I think always someone going to be unhappy about it.
So but I think one of the probably objectives of the tagging system as well is that it allows you to begin to start collecting more detailed data in terms of animals that are culled and so on. Where at the moment, as I said, there's annual hunter cull returns are not verified, but they're the nearest thing we have to data. And I think that's what we are missing is that I know has been mooted in terms of developing an app that hunters can use. For example, when they cull an animal, they can input the details.
Yeah.
The issue around that, sometimes hunters have a fear, if I disclose the location of where I shot that deer,
Of course.
someone else is going to know.
Yeah,
But look, I think at this stage, most people in Ireland know, your major forestries and mountainous areas and where deer are and aren't. So that is a concern. But we absolutely need to have a better handle in terms of the numbers.
Yeah. So you mentioned already the tag system, which I think would be great if we had that. Do you think that the license for deer should be, we should pay for that and get the money that way to fund it, or do you like the idea that it's free?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in the sense of, I was actually part of an exercise where we surveyed hunters with that question.
Oh, great!
And
what was it interesting?
So we asked that question, and I don't recall what the percentage was, but what I do recall is that the majority of hunters were in favour of a fee being charged for a deer hunting licence.
Really?
But there was a major but included. Once that money was ring fenced.
Of course.
In the sense of, from the point of view of either conservation, or particularly what a motive topic was in terms of having more conservation rangers in terms of tackling wildlife crime or deer poaching.
Yes.
Which is a huge topic. So that was the I suppose the caveat that came with the yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that it was going to be a deer hunting license fee.
Yeah, of course.
And into the state coffers, it was a case that money was specifically ring fenced for.
That's actually I should qualify that as well with that, and I think that's just fantastic what you just said, because to be honest, I thought that the majority would say no. And this is kind of similar, again, like an example in the US, when majority of the hunters were okay with it being taxed, and I suppose this speaks buckets to the fact that the hunters are conservationists and they really care about the animal, because look, majority of them actually have nothing against paying for a license that is for free now. Just take that money and use it for. So I think that's a great thing to say. Listen. Another controversial topic a little bit is I think at the moment is a HCAP and the qualification required, or that's supposed to be this year, the qualification. So HCAP is a Hunter's Competence Assessment Program, which is essentially like a course where people are learning about how to assess the population, how to call the deer, basics of the wildlife law, basics of the firearm law, meat handling, deer biology, and how to tell species of deer and so on, and range tests to prove their proficiency with a firearm. So that's supposed to be mandatory from this year. There was a big pushback, and as far as I know, it was promised that it will be mandatory from no later than by 2020. Okay, what's your take on the HCAP qualification, and do you think that all the people should have it? Not really. Where do you stand in that?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I think all forms of training for hunters can only be a positive thing. So I would say I think under the last set of data I saw, the majority of hunters have already completed the HCAP, and there's also other courses now being offered as well, similar courses. But I would say in terms of HCAP, currently in its current form, is designed as a basic first step for hunters. So it's not designed to make somebody an expert. So it's just to have the basic level of knowledge in terms of conservation, the law, safety, and so on. So it's a good first attempt to promote that activity. I'm aware, as I said again, and again, respect everybody's views, that there has been some pushback from some individuals in terms of having a mandatory certification. And people, some of the feedback I've heard on that has come from different views that say somebody's been hunting all their lives, maybe haven't sat exams in maybe 10, 20, 30 years, and are concerned to sort of say, God, having to sit an exam. So first of all, I think the recommendations around this were not specifically around HCAP. I know HCAP has got a lot of tension on it. I think the wording was HCAP or similar.
Yes.
So I don't think anybody was promoting to sort of say it should be HCAP only. And I think if you talk to Liam Nolan, who's the administrator for HCAP, he will tell you the same thing. It's HCAP or similar. What I would see is it is something that is going to happen. If you look again a lot of our European neighbours have mandatory certification. Other countries don't. But I would very much see that it is something that is going to come in, and I think it's a positive thing. I think people have. I think change sometimes brings fear and uncertainty. It's a human reaction to things to sort of say, God, this is something we haven't had to do before. Now they're bringing this in on us. Or, you know, when you hear the word mandatory as well, some people like to kick back from the word mandatory and say,
before they know what that is.
I'm not going to have someone tell me what to do. But yeah, I would say very much a positive thing. You know, all forms of hunting, I think, is absolutely.
I agree, and I think it's just really, you know, almost crazy to allow people to run around with the firearms without any sort of like even basic level ensuring that they know what they're doing. And you know, even on the exam when I was like, the range test is, you know, it's fairly easy. You have a 4-inch group, you know, 100 yards prone position, and then so it's easy, especially, you know, if someone's shooting, and a guy who was next to me, you know, he couldn't group 4-inch from prone position 100 yards, and I thought at the time, I don't want this guy around on the same land where I'm stalking, because like, if he can control his body and what he's doing with the firearm under pressure on the exam, well, what if he sees this big deer? Like, it's the same story, right? I would like him to be able to control, actually, 4 inches, not that that small. So I completely agree with that. It's interesting. So what is the next step? What's the next step after someone completed HCAP or similar, but there's many. Like, what would be the next step, next exam that someone can take if they want to kind of, progress with their education?
Currently, at the moment, there's no further step available in Ireland, unfortunately. So I know there has been suggestions motored of a HCAP 2 level. So if you look at the UK, for example, or near neighbours, they would have what they call the DSE 1, DSE 2,
exactly,
an advanced deer managers course. So they have a number of different levels of courses that they can do. So I think for some people, HCAP in its own will be enough for them. But there's a lot of hunters out there have a desire to learn more and only improve in terms of their management skills and in terms of welfare and so on. So I think there will be certain hunters out there will want to progress further in terms of their education and so on. And I think that's a real positive thing. And it just shows, I suppose, the professionalism and the attitude of hunters in terms of wanting to do things right, and obviously animal welfare in terms of managing deer as well, that they're doing the right thing. So I would say there's very much an appetite amongst a certain section of the deer hunting community for further education. Yeah.
So at the moment, this is only UK. This is
only the UK.
And what's the name of the exam then?
In the UK exam, So I mentioned there's the DSE 1, DSE 2.
Is it like DSE 1 equivalent of HCAP?
Correct.
So people who already have a HCAP, they would need to go for DSE 2.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yes.
And what is it? There's also I think it's a European certification called Certified Hunter, or am I right saying that?
Yes, it's not something that's relevant to Ireland. But it's again, it's further education. In my own case, for example, I would have sat the Advanced Deer Managers course in the UK. So I mentioned you have the DSE 1, DSE 2, and the Advanced Deer Managers course, and that covered all aspects of developing deer management plans, conservation at a very detailed level, even aging deer. Right. In terms of their teeth and so on. So very interesting. Obviously, when you're doing an exam and something that you love doing, it makes it even better.
That's how I found HCAP. I enjoyed it. It was great because I learned so much about it. It was great.
I think sometimes people, as I said, with the HCAP I've seen where they have an excellent manual, as you would have seen. The manual itself is a fantastic resource for information, and people often say to me, God, do I need to know the manual, inside out? That's not the case, as you know yourself when you have sat the exam. The exams there are 50 questions. You must get 40 right to pass, and they're basic, most of them common sense questions. But the manual itself, you could probably have 2 or 3 different levels of exams from that, because some of the information is quite detailed.
It's a great resource. The manual is a great resource.
Yeah, absolutely.
Listen, it's great. The picture you're painting is really quite positive, and especially I think the picture of a hunting community. That people are so. I think you answered my question about hunters as a conservationist in Ireland, even though there is no monetary contribution. How does it work? And I want to ask you about one other thing, which is going on right now. It's quite a big thing with Irish Deer Commission, and this is preventing of poaching and wildlife crime. Can you tell us how bad is the problem and what you're doing to address that problem?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of wildlife crime, in general, it's been recently stated by that wildlife crime if we look at it at a European level, after drugs, firearms, and human trafficking, it's the 4th biggest crime in terms of revenue generation. So because we think of just deer, but obviously it expands across all types of endangered species and so on.
And how the revenue is generated?
I think the numbers I've seen are run into the billions.
But I wonder how. Like it can't be just for sale of venison.
No, it doesn't say. It covers across trading in protected species and rhino horn, and
Gotcha.
Yeah, it covers an aspect.
Right.
But from an Irish context point of view, is I suppose the main forms of wildlife crime that we see are deer poaching, which I'll speak a bit more in a moment. We also see illegal hare coursing. We see, in terms of killing or, of raptors, we've seen incidents of seagulls being poisoned, and so on. And finching is another common one as well in terms of trapping of live birds. But in terms of, I'll come back to deer poaching, I suppose, we've mentioned earlier on is that deer can be legally culled under special license from the 1st of September to the 28th of February. And within that, then there's a male and a female season. Yeah. Obviously, in the case of County Kerry, there's no open season for red deer. Is there a protected species throughout the entire county? And obviously, hunting then within national parks is also illegal as well, because that's a matter for National Parks and Wildlife Service. But deer as well can be culled 1 hour before sunrise and 1 hour after the official sunset time. But the most common forms of wildlife crime or deer poaching that we see is the use of lamps at night to dazzle deer, confuse the deer. The deer is either shot or is set upon by dogs. The latter is one of the most barbaric wildlife crimes that you'll see, because when the deer is chased down by the dogs, it's either bludgeoned to death or has its throat cut. And it's a horrific crime and it's something, I suppose deer poaching in general is something that hunters, it detests. If you talk to any hunter and they hear of people illegally killing deer, it actually, makes their blood boil, it does. It's an emotive topic. So yeah, they're the real main forms, I suppose, of deer poaching in terms of at night. But also then we see people shooting out of season, which is also a crime. We see armed trespass, people trespassing on land that they don't have permission to be on, and so on. But I suppose in terms of what we've seen in recent years is on Garda Síochána, National Parks and Wildlife Service came together under what they call Operation Bambi. Very aptly named.
So that's going on for a number of years.
A number of years, and it's been highly successful. It has. So I suppose Operation Bambi was set up with the purpose of highlighting, investigating incidents of deer poaching. And at the cornerstone of that has been hunters themselves, because the vast majority of reports for suspected activity of deer poaching comes from hunters themselves.
They're
on
the ground.
They're on the ground, exactly, yeah. So the rise in the years, and as I mentioned, it's something that they detest. So I remember speaking to somebody in the UK, for example, and they were astounded when they heard the majority of reports actually come from hunters, because it's something they don't see in the UK. So kudos and credit to Irish hunters for that. But I suppose, in what we've seen is Operation Bambi has been highly successful. And we recently held our launch event at the Irish Fly Fishing and Game Shooting Museum in Durrow, in County Laois. And Inspector Martin Walker, or Superintendent, Martin Walker, was one of our speakers on the night. And he announced at that event that, as in from September onwards, that on Garda Síochána, under the direction of an assistant Garda commissioner, have now looked for an inspector from each Garda division to be trained in terms of, I suppose, understanding the legislation and understanding the signs, and in terms of around wildlife crime and specifically deer poaching as well. So that is a very positive development, because if we look internationally, what works extremely well is wildlife liaison officers. So these are not additional Gardaí, additional members of the police force, but they're individuals there that are trained up to be specialists in that area. So at least if I suppose a common issue that we face is that if you contact a member of Garda Síochána and they're not familiar with the legislation, they don't really know what to do. And understandably, Garda Síochána have lots of various directives and issues that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But to have people that are specialised in the area and understand what they're doing is to be welcomed, and it is positive. What we've seen as well in recent years as well is that an increase in the number of detections, an increase in the number of prosecutions, and rather than just looking at the Wildlife Acts now, it's also been looked at in terms of the various other legislation, in terms of the Animal Health and Welfare legislation, the Criminal Justice Act. So you're looking at, for example, is there a vehicle being used in committing the crime, and so on, because there is a perception amongst hunters that there's a high potential gain from the crime, but a low risk of being caught. So the potential financial rewards are quite lucrative, for these individuals, because I still
don't see it, to be honest. Where is that reward, that monetary reward for poaching a deer?
Yeah. So if you take, for example, a red deer, it's again, just picking a rough figure, say someone was to receive €150 per carcass, and was to go out at night and kill 10 of them illegally, and sell them into the food chain. It's effectively €1,500 cash. So, and we've quite a low, I suppose we have improved the traceability in recent years, where we're a long way short. Even if you look at domestic livestock, we have excellent traceability. But in terms of deer, there's a lot of loopholes still there, where an individual can go out and illegally kill deer, and sell them into the food chain. And the issue we have, we've seen examples where a lot of these deer are killed at night, left in the countryside overnight, and collected during daylight hours to avoid suspicion. And obviously, as like any carcass that's left in the countryside overnight, it's open to be fed on, vermin. And then to think that meat then is entering the food chain, and impacting the reputation of what is a fantastic product and a fantastic meat. Because they are the overwhelming majority of hunters that do sell venison, and it's the minority. The majority consume for their own needs. So there is a legitimate reason to sell venison that has been legally shot. But when you mix illegal venison in that potentially could impact on human health, it's a different scenario.
Listen, question I have about the wildlife crime. So how, as the wildlife crime stands at the moment in Ireland, does that pose any danger for hunters at the moment? Do you know about any cases? Because obviously, sometimes these are gangs, organized gangs of people and so on. So is it going on kind of silently at night, and the reason I'm asking that, because I know from other countries that sometimes there were concerns over fly fishermen to fish certain stretches of the rivers, because that's a stretch of the river that is known that is being poached, and there are shady characters with firearms there, so you don't go fish there. Is that the case for hunters at the moment in Ireland?
I would say I suppose this form of crime typically takes place at night, when most people are tucked up in their beds. They're operating under the hours of darkness. So I suppose from that aspect, they generally don't come into contact with genuine hunters, or legitimate hunters. It does happen from time to time that they do come into contact, but the advice we'd always give is never approach somebody. Is just take note of the details and contact your local Garda station or
And
National
now,
Parks
if on the
Wildlife.
Garda station you have actually somebody dedicated to that, you have a person to contact.
Correct.
Which then makes things so much easier.
Much
and
easier.
more effective.
So I would say, you know, with Superintendent Martin Walker's speech at our event, he referenced to a number of scenarios where landowners have, you know, confronted these criminals on their land and have been assaulted. So I think there's a real risk to people in rural communities. I think there's a real risk in the sense of that legitimate deer stalkers, while culling deer, you know, safety is a huge aspect, and I already mentioned the welfare of the animal is at the centre of this. Is that the one thing you're always looking to do is to ensure, you know, when culling animals, that there's a safe backdrop.
Yeah.
If you have somebody discharging a firearm in a reckless manner at night, and they're not aware of what the backdrop is, it puts people's lives at risk.
Yeah.
And we've seen incidences in different parts of the country where homes have been struck or vehicles have been struck.
Yeah.
And we regularly see livestock that are shot at night, regularly. And I think if you speak to anybody in the various knackery yards that deal with animal carcasses, they'll tell you they regularly see animals that have been shot at night by these criminals. So it's there's a real risk there. I suppose what we see again in internationally is where you have deer poaching and wildlife crime, you'll also see an increase in general crime in that area. So it has, you know, because some people might say, look, God, it's just deer. It's just deer. I want them culled, and I don't care how. But they actually, by, you know, so maybe somebody inadvertently turning a blind eye to that crime, they're actually putting their neighbours, their livestock, themselves at risk. And it actually makes the management of deer far more difficult. You know, because if deer, I suppose deer have three main needs in life. First of all, they want food, they want shelter, and they want peace and quiet. And if any of those are taken away or disturbed, deer will move, and they will move into new areas. So if you have an area where, you know, deer are being constantly, you know, dazzled at night with a lamp or chased by dogs, they will just leave the area and move on to a new. Eventually, they'll move back when the scenario it doesn't move it doesn't deal with the problem. But what it does, it makes the management of deer far more difficult, because the deer become very skittish. You know, they're very. If you're looking at deer in areas where there's a lot of wildlife crime, the deer are very jumpy. You know, they're very difficult to get near, and it's difficult to manage them, as opposed to where proper best practice deer management takes place is that it's selective, it's gradual. It's done legally, obviously. It's done with regard for safety and welfare. So there's huge risks from this. You know, we're would always urge landowners to ensure that deer are only culled legally and in the legal manner. And you know, if they're frustrated in the field, they have a problem with deer, just talk to their local hunter.
Exactly.
And you know.
They will gladly help you.
Gladly help them out. Yeah.
Listen, well, just to finish it off. One last practical question. So practical question for hunters out there. If I'm hunting on the land that I have permission, right, and shot the deer, and a deer runs and goes outside of the boundary of the land that I have a permission to hunt, right, and might or might not expire somewhere else, what to do in that case? Because if you just go after it, you're trespassing.
Correct. Okay?
Yeah. So what should hunter do in that case?
Yeah, I'm smiling when you're asking that question, because you may have recalled from your HCAP exam that is one of the questions contained in the exam, if my memory recalls.
Well, yes, but the answer is, you know, the answer is not practical, and there was many, like, I'm telling. So there was also that statement, but by Liam often said, like, I'm telling you what the law is, not what practically do.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm asking you, like, what to do practically, because according to the law, and let's check if I got it right, the deer now belongs to a person on which land it expired, and you don't have a permission to go there, right? But that's not necessarily something right to do, just to leave that deer there to rot. Okay?
Yes, correct.
And you not always are able to, you know, identify who that person is, who owns the land, or maybe that it's a chill land and so on. So practically, what to do in that case?
Yeah. I'm going to ask you from the law's point of view, if you don't mind. But because I think you mentioned when deer are alive, they're not owned by anybody.
Yes.
When deer are dead, it's the person that is either killed the animal or on the property of the person that the animal is dead on. But or should I say, the person that owns the sporting rights as well. But so from a legal point of view, obviously you can't just trespass on somebody's land. I know from a welfare point of view and an ethical point of view, you're trying to recover an animal that's either dead or injured. And thankfully, first of all, I suppose before you even get to that situation, you obviously when you're culling deer, you want to ensure the animal is culled humanely and efficiently, and it doesn't have to run, but it does happen very occasionally that a deer may not be killed immediately and it runs a distance. But from all I can say from a legal point of view is that obviously you need to get the landowner's permission before pursuing the animal. And I don't think any hunter would be in a scenario where they sort of say, look, I'm not going onto that land, I'm going to leave the deer there. I think everyone would make an effort to track down the landowner and so on. The risk with it and the unintended consequence of you doing the opposite of maybe going onto the land is that where the scenario you've described is a legitimate, genuine reason, you could have individuals would use that as an excuse, maybe possibly to be on land for other reasons.
You shot that deer on that land.
Yeah. It's the same. It's the same. If people come across deer who have been involved in a road traffic accident, the law states the animal can be dispatched by legal means, but you also must notify a conservation ranger that you've done that, because again it creates a cover for someone to sort of say, that maybe necessarily the deer wasn't involved in an accident and is shot for other reasons. But again, I don't think any of this kind of stuff applies to the overwhelming majority of hunters.
So anyway, the best way to avoid that scenario is like know who owns the land around the land that you have a permission to shoot up front, to be at least be able to contact them, or use an anchoring shot, so the animal is on the spot, dies on the spot, rather than.
What I would add to that as well is that deer have a range that they operate in, so they don't operate in X field and not that field. They operate over a certain area, and to properly manage deer in an area, you need to be able to manage the range of the deer, and that may encompass several landowners within that area. It may include forestry, it may include mountain. So it's important that you work with landowners in the area to manage because, as I said, if you're tied to just a specific field, it's very difficult to say you can manage deer in that one field or a number of fields.
Exactly, Damien. So I have to ask you that question, and this is really nicely ties, and I think it's really nicely going to conclude that episode of the podcast. So, on one hand, you're saying Irish Deer Commission kind of works to develop local plans for managing deer, right? And that thing that you just said, do you think that the properly developed plan for managing deer should also include access to the land to cull deer or to hunt deer? Because with the absence of that, you're inevitably ending up with a scenario where I have access to this field and the other guy have access to this field, and then that makes it so much more difficult, like you just said. So do you think that the kind of all-encompassing plan for managing deer should also not only include the cull quotas, but also regulate somehow access to the land where you can hunt deer?
Yeah, I think in terms of access to land is, first of all, it's the landowner's right to decide who can come onto their land or not come onto their land.
But then if they're part of the scheme,
that's why it's important to have everybody joined up thinking, and working together, landowners, hunters and so on, because that is the case. I should preface to say, I know we discussed at some length in terms about deer management groups and so on, and the reality is that, we're very far away from that in Ireland, so it's not something we're saying in the Irish Deer Commission that will happen next year or the year after. That's a space that we need to get to and we want to get to, so it's not, I don't want people to think that next year, oh God, there's going to be local deer management groups or something like that.
Hopefully, well, that's ideal, right?
Yeah. And this is not unique. If you look at the Irish Deer Management Forum that I mentioned earlier on as well, that is an aspiration of the Irish Deer Management Forum, which represents all stakeholders. So it's it's something that we're very far away. There's huge issues facing deer at the moment in terms of their management or conservation. that we need to address before we even get anywhere near deer management groups, but it is an area we go. But the one thing I would just sort of say is that I think in terms of deer management in Ireland, it's important that any statements or decisions that we make about their management are not arbitrary seat of the pants or results of political pressure, that they must be based on factual data. And we really need to get away from using them as a political football in terms of
that's counterproductive.
Yeah, and that's not for a moment discarding anyone's views or concerns that they have. And I said they are. They are farmers, landowners, foresters that have legitimate concerns, that have legitimate issues, and we must address those issues as well and support those people. But it is important, as I said, that we base any decisions on management not as a result of pressure. It has to come on factual data.
Absolutely. So for anyone who wants to get involved and help with that fantastic work, how to get involved, how to get in touch, and what they should do?
Very simple. Just go on to our website, irishdeercommission.ie, and just click on the membership tab, and you can apply for membership there. And through that, it's very cost effective. We're looking to promote younger people coming into the association and into deer management, and I suppose the next generation of deer managers. So our junior membership is just €10 per year. We have an ordinary membership for adults is €20, and a family membership for €25 per year. So it's a very small fee to join. It's voluntary work. It's something that we all give up selfishly for the betterment of deer and what we believe in.
And then when people are involved, they can also take action and take part on the local actions and be informed through the newsletter or anything.
Correct.
Like that about
Correct. Yes. Communication is key.
So it's not going to be only like this 15 or 10 euro or 35 euro. It's more behind that.
Absolutely. There's many benefits to being a member in terms of events, in terms of information, and also having an input in terms of because the views of the association are ultimately the views of the members. So, for people that have a concern or an issue in terms of a particular area, and if we're speaking to one of the state agencies or one of the stakeholder groups, we can feed back in that members' feedback. Obviously, you have to take a general consensus because there will be different views, but, just to take the general consensus of our membership.
Yes. Damien, thank you very much for doing this. It's a great organization. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I hope we're gonna get more members to the Irish Deer Commission through that COSAT. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.
And that was another episode of Tommy's Outdoors podcast, a special edition deer season opener. Don't forget to email info@irishdeercommission.ie to make sure you have a place in a route walk in Killarney National Park. And other than that, if you enjoyed the podcast and you haven't subscribed yet, then I think you should fix that and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or any other platform when you're aggregating your podcast. Also, follow us on Twitter @Outdoors Podcast and Facebook and Instagram @Tommy's Outdoors. So until the next time, bye-bye.